9:30 hour having arrived. Thursday, September 6, 2018 meeting of the Water Quality Management Committee will come to order. We are joined by our dutiful lead lady, our dutiful planning board member, our dutiful enterprise guy, and Bill Sherford from the Oyster Pond Environmental Trust. A couple of things on the agenda today, both of which are likely to involve a good deal of time, which we do not have a good deal of. 5 o'clock, the Board of Appeals has asked us to leave because they are starting early and they will need the room. So I would urge everyone to be succinct and we'll move on as fast as we can. The third item on the agenda may wait till the next meeting, but we'll certainly try to get to the first two. First one is discussion of a management plan for innovative alternative septic systems, a generalized plan and an Oyster Pond plan, which at the moment have been sort of part of the same conversation. Those of you who went to the Oyster Pond meeting or saw it on television, basically the Oyster Pond watershed is being considered for two possible options for removed nitrogen. One is the classical sewer collection system, and the other is the innovative alternative system. The idea behind that is largely on the table as a result of what George Hoyfelder has been doing at the Massachusetts Test Center for the last several years, which is looking all across the country and trying to identify innovative alternative systems that remove nitrogen in a cost-efficient and consumer-friendly manner. And we're very lucky to have him here today to join us in this conversation. He and our group, working group, have been putting together an implementation plan for Oyster Pond, and obviously for any other estuary that would be appropriate. We all got a copy of it earlier this week. I think probably John, if you could kind of
just to sort of start off the discussion. One of the things when we began thinking about something like Oyster Pond watershed as a place to use IAs to remediate nitrogen was that if you put 150 of these in the ground, the town is going to have a pretty robust management scheme in order for DEP to give us a discharge permit for a watershed like that. So we started out by developing a generic management plan that would have worked in any watershed. And we've done that. I can't remember when the committee finalized that, but it was
nearly a year ago.
Nearly a year ago. And that has been up to DEP, at least to the southeast region, and has gotten comments back from Brian Dudley. And I think they looked at that plan reasonably favorably. So we thought in the working group as the next step there was to then take that management plan and extend it and actually put together an implementation plan for Oyster Pond that would use that management plan and would have a phased implementation plan and would use IAs that meet 10 milligrams per liter or 75% removal of nitrogen. And so that is what we're looking at today. It's almost, what's new today really is the first page. The rest of it adheres pretty closely to that management plan that we developed last year. So I don't know, do we want to go through?
Sure.
Yeah.
If you want to save time, I propose that we not make grammatical corrections and things like the number 3.1.4 is missing and just talk about substantive things. Mm-hmm. Let the working group do the grammar later.
Absolutely. Okay.
But I think we should go through it section by section. I think that that's
Okay. Some of the sections won't involve much comment.
Well, right.
Some will.
Right.
Okay. Do you want to do that? Or you want me to?
Sure. So the definition section is simply taking acronyms and putting definitions to them. I don't think that's anything we need to agonize over. The watershed boundaries for Oyster Pond were taken from the Wright Pierce
Could I just say, under the watershed boundaries, there is a technical difference between a comprehensive wastewater management plan, CWMP, and a targeted watershed management plan. The TWMP is the DEP's regulatory way of handling one watershed at a time with the plan for that particular watershed. And that's why the word T for targeted. That's the meaning that it carries there. Provided that that watershed is totally within the boundaries of the town of Falmouth. But when you get to a watershed that we share with Bourne or that we share with Mashpee, then we have to do a CWMP, and there are other regulatory things that come into play. We've, in this, put both of those words in, and ultimately, in order to do Oyster Pond, there will be a T-targeted plan with an actual boundary that town meeting will vote.
So there are a lot of instances here where it hasn't been successfully changed. I call them grammar, but it hasn't been changed from the generic version that we already approved to the version for Oyster Pond.
It's
And
evolving.
you got to pick one. This can't be both.
Right, but we're evolving in that direction.
Well, I mean, it's titled Oyster Pond, so
Okay.
it ought to be just TWMP.
Just T. I see what you mean. Okay.
I mean, it's nitpicking and it's grammar, but
You were just
tell me what.
telling us not to do that.
Okay.
But it is the intent that this one is specific for Oyster Pond, right?
Okay, so it will be a TWMP and not a CWMP, is that what I'm hearing?
I think that's the implication, right?
That's where we're going to end up. The town is gonna file a draft CWMP, but when it finally gets to, this is the plan for the Oyster Pond watershed, that will be a TWMP, so it's a subsequent document.
And the boundaries, as described in the coastal overlay map that we just got, that I understand is going to be voted at town meeting this fall,
Right.
those will be the regulatory boundaries also for each targeted watershed.
Yes.
But there's wording in here to allow a subset of that, which is certainly the intention for Oyster
Right.
But
Pond.
that's later.
But-
It's not
Yeah.
this.
Yeah,
Yes.
I'm just kind of semantical, but I'm
Before we go any further, I might say that what we're trying to do with this, our CWMP, which will include Oyster Pond, will have to be turned in December of 2019. And what we're trying to do with this, instead of dropping this in DEP's lap in December of 2019, is to let them react to what we think is a reasonable plan to manage a watershed with enhanced IAs. And so what we would like to do with this is, after we finish massaging this, is to send it up to DEP the way we did with the management plan and get them to react.
Absolutely.
Okay.
So does 2.0 require any change?
I don't think so at this point.
All right, then let's move on to 3.0.
So the plan there then, and this is taken from the Wright-Pierce analysis, I always get confused, alternatives analysis for Oyster Pond. We need to remove 3,019 pounds.
Okay, so it's been rounded.
Well, I rounded it to 3,000, and Eric and I had a discussion about that. He likes real numbers, so.
So we're 1 pound a year
Over.
apart. If we get to that point, I don't think any of us are going to be unhappy.
We're done.
So then, and I think that's a fairly straightforward statement.
Okay.
We need to take that out, and we plan to do that in a two-phase program. And then the next part is really what the meat of the matter is and why we've asked George to come today. In order to do that, we're going to use enhanced, innovative, alternative septic systems that meet either 10 milligrams per liter or achieve a 75% removal of nitrogen. to install within the watershed. So the old systems that were permitted by DEP for 19 milligrams per liter aren't going to cut it. So then we move on to section 3.1.1. And there, George and I have been, Matt?
I have a question about 3.1. So 75% removal, does that mean that if the influent is 80 and you measure 20, then that it would be considered acceptable?
Yes.
Okay.
So in other words, we're saying if you don't get to 10, but you can demonstrate to us that you're getting 75% removal by mass ballots, then we'll consider that. And many of these systems, in fact, have influence that are considerably higher than the 38, which is what Title V is built on.
But if they all are, we have a problem, right? Because we need twice as many systems to...
Well, I would argue that if we get 75% removal of what's coming into that watershed, we're going to be in reasonable shape. But that's why we've set it out as a two-phase program.
Yeah, thanks, Eric. This would be, shovel would go in the ground on this possibly after 2025, right?
Well, that's a later discussion, but it could easily be before 2025.
Yeah, we're speaking about 3.1 here, not funding timetables.
No, I know it's 3.1, right, because it talks about using IAs,
Yes.
right? So that's the thing. I'm just wondering if it's further down the road, okay, and IAs will be changing, they'll be getting better, I assume, but the effluent issue from the wastewater treatment plant or as new sites may come online in the time, because we're considering Great Pond and it has to go somewhere. So if we have that option and it's less costly to do a central sewer system, and there is an opportunity to dispose of the effluent, then I would think that we would want to revisit that between now and the time this is done. So rather than focusing, I mean, there should be...
Well, today's focus is on this.
I know, I'm saying, what I'm saying is...
We understand that there's another option that could be available, but that's...
No, what I'm saying is that this is a very specific plan,
Yeah.
yet there is still an alternative that could be applied.
That's
And
right.
therefore, this thing that says plan under 3.0 might include
So
the
Ron,
other option.
when we submit the CWMP in December of 2019, we have to have a preferred plan and an alternate plan. Now, if this is our preferred plan, you know the state is going to approve sewer if that's our alternate plan. So, you know, I think at the moment, our intent is that this would be our preferred plan.
Well, it could say preferred plan. It doesn't, see, it says plan, and the thing is that we don't know what's coming, and that there's a lot of stuff happening with regard to effluent discharge from a central system. And if that's less costly,
We get that.
okay? So I know you get it, but I'm saying that this looks,
That's not today's discussion topic.
but
I
it
think I can
says,
mediate this.
I think,
Briefly. I think what Ron hasn't seen this as many times as some of us have. Implied in the title is implementation plan to meet the TMDL compliance for Oyster Pond in the case that IAs are used.
okay, all right. Well, I'll let that rest. I still think it's valid because we're looking at this a little narrowly. The second point is, and of course George is here, so that's good. I mean, my understanding of the experience with IAs in general, when we say 75% removal, George, well, what you said in many discussions is that when the 50% removal equals 19 milligrams per liter, okay, so that would be 38, okay, is a total, then that is achieved 75% of the time under the current experience. And so, so I don't know how that factor has been put in here, that if we say 75% of the removal, then it is what percent of the time, this assumes 100% of the time, I assume, but if 50% is achieved 75% of the time with a target of 19, and then on the other side of it, if 50% from the experience is 30 milligrams per liter, then that is somewhere between 50 and 90% of the time achieved. Okay, the 30 milligrams. So the point is that this says, assuming 75% removal, but what percent of the time is the question?
Why don't we let George speak on that?
Well,
Yeah.
Ron, when you get to the last page of this, it lays out how we demonstrate to DEP that we actually are achieving what we have planned to achieve. And,
Well, actually, I'd like to hear from George, if that's possible.
well, I think we're almost ready to launch into the discussion of how we've begun to lay out what those systems might have to do. George, you want to go through that?
Sure. So, Ron, what you've done is summarized all the data that we've put together for 2,000 plus systems out there. And the one-liner for that is they achieve 50% of removal 77% of the time under the assumptions of Title V. But lay that aside because there's no longer in this plan any assumption. There's a measurement. There's a measurement that's made at a discharge point prior to any treatment. And once you can get that, then you can very accurately calculate what the percent removal is. And the cumulative of that has to meet that goal, that TMDL goal. So if you absolutely know what's going in, and you absolutely know how much water is going in and what concentration is coming out, then you can calculate a load. And that's the whole purpose of this. And the technologies that are being suggested here, and I'll go into that a little later, the quick pan on how they were developed and what we know, but each one is able to tell you what goes in, what concentration goes in, how much water is going in at that concentration, what's coming out. And when you can do that, you have a very fine tune in on what the load reduction is. And that's exactly what a treatment plant can do. How many gallons in at what concentration, how many gallons out at what concentration. So these are different than nearly every system out there because most of the IA technologies, that's innovative alternative septic system technologies, most of those technologies cannot make that calculation simply because fundamental to their use is to recirculate back some of that treated to be retreated, so no one can get a real accurate influent number of them. They just can't. It's not achievable in most residential homeowner situations. The technology suggested here, it is achievable because you're catching what comes out of that septic tank, it's dead. There's no recirculation there, there's nothing, it then goes through a treatment unit and you measure the difference. So let's talk a little bit about the treatment and why it's sort of considered here for implementation in a watershed. Over the past probably 6 or 7 years, there's been a big push and a lot of research done on more passive systems that are not particularly proprietary systems. The state of Florida invested a lot of money in trying to find out, is there a passive means to do nitrogen removal? And they spent millions of dollars and lots of consultants trying to figure that out. And their answer came back, yes, there are some non-proprietary ways, and they're passive, and they perform well, and they give a good track record. So, being as what we do, the county health department, we looked into that particular program, along with other demonstration projects across the country, and said, you know, what's coming about here is a push to get sustainable, inexpensive ways to remove nitrogen in an on-site setting. And inexpensive, I realize, that's a relative term, you know, to a millionaire, $20,000 is nothing. To me, that's quite a bit. So what we've looked at is looking at the field of what's out there now and available that people are working on and researching, and even some commercial products which are modifying themselves in response to some of the research we're doing and others, because they realize you need a sustainable means to do it cheaply. Operating cost, capital cost, and everybody's trying to push that down to a reasonable number, because in the end, what does it come down to? Performance and money. How much does it cost per pound of nitrogen to remove? That's what everybody wants to know. And in the end run, a community like ours gets a choice to say, we'll take the best available technology to do it on site, and that has a cost associated with it. Capital, upkeep, management, monitoring, the whole thing, everything DEP will require to verify that you're doing it. And you balance that against, okay, as you said, the sewer. The sewer may become the least expensive option. But you should have another option, because there are other things aside from just money, and we know that. There's other things besides just money that communities make decisions on. Intrusiveness, no, I don't want a big pipe, I don't want this, I don't want that. So this is all about giving yourselves a choice of what to do in a watershed. Prior to this, the technologies did not bear the removal percentages, rates, loads reductions that even came close to what a treatment plant did. But now they're edging closer to that number. They're becoming a best available technology that might even rival a treatment plant discharge. So we look at, and we've looked at the test center for the past 4 years now at using cellulose or wood chips, sawdust, a waste product for a carbon source for denitrification. And this is not new. It's been around a while. You know, in fact, you've probably heard from Pio Lombardo on a system called a Nitrex, which was configured not so passively, and the expense was rather high, considerably higher than anybody would want to pay. But now with more people working with that same concept, using the cellulose and the wood, and trying to make it passive, and passive meaning you're not pumping a whole lot of air into the system, you might move it around with a low power pump, that's where the field, or the sort of the universe of things is moving. So you have Florida looking at it. I just read, just before I came here, opened the book, surprised the heck out of me, that Connecticut, of all states, don't even allow alternative septic systems, is now allowing a simple layering of a carbon source, such as sawdust or wood, beneath a standard system. And they're doing it for one purpose. They think they'll get nitrogen removal for very low cost. They're doing it in gravity systems, doing it in pressure dose systems. So there's more and more people moving that downfield, and we're moving it downfield with the research we're doing. We may not be carrying the ball, but we're definitely moving things toward looking at passive means of removal. There are a number of them out there now that are doing it in a non-proprietary way. State of Florida, now Connecticut, Colorado called me recently, and it then bears us worth looking at. So what are the risks? The risks are, hey, it's non-proprietary, like I'm fooling around out there, am I going to put my money behind it? No, I'll give you an honest opinion on how they work in a design that works the best, but we believe by putting this forward, as I was talking to John, and saying, let's put something forward that pushes that boundary. Because the boundary is not really being pushed. We know it can achieve these numbers. Now what we will need is somebody to come forward and say, Town of Falmouth, yeah, I can come up with the generic design for that watershed. Here's what it will cost. Here's how I will either guarantee it or not guarantee it. And sort of move toward using those low energy, more passive units in a watershed to achieve a TMDL. Can 10 be achieved? We already know that. A Nitrex, for instance, which uses the same principle. It's a box of wood chips following a nitrification system. They know. I mean, I know now, after 15 years of data, that, yeah, that system works. Well, that system works on a pretty simple principle, which a lot of people are now copying, simply because, one, The patent has expired, so people are playing with it, we're playing with it, and other companies are. There's a small company out in the island that just started up. They're using wood chips passively, putting it through a box with nitrification in the box as well as a denitrification. That's a company that just started a year and a half ago, and they've been experimenting at our test center. So we know that there will be a time, and it may be a very short time, that somebody will come forward and say, yeah, I'll guarantee my product will do that. Here's how it needs to be managed. Here's how it works. Here's the configuration. And, you know, it offers the ability, an option for a town to look in a watershed, and Oyster Pond is a nice candidate for that, and say, okay, we'll try this means of doing it. Now, what will it involve? Besides putting the system in, and we've talked about this with John, and we know it because we've managed all the ones across the county, over 2,000 of them now, and then off Cape we manage a bunch, that it needs a management structure that will ensure the regulators that you're monitoring them, that they're being maintained, the contracts are being maintained, and somebody takes responsibility for them. And those are the pieces that are also woven in here, along with just the technology. So I think the technology is there. I think it needs a little bit refinement. The data that we're getting so far indicates that some of the assumptions of Title V of 38 milligrams per liter coming out of the septic tank are probably inadequate. I know the one that we have out in North Falmouth at 100, that comes in 100, its average is 96. Now, we're getting out of that system, we know 96 is going in, we're getting 12. We're not getting 10, we're getting 12. Is that 75% removal? By my math, it says, yeah, we're doing better than 75%. Now, if that was just, you were just looking at concentration and saying, oh, I'll assume 38, you're getting 12. Well, that's not so good. But when you can get that influent number and the load and the gallonage that those folks are using, you have the load reductions. That's just what you need to apply this technology in context of a total daily maximum load, or watershed plan. So that's my story. I'm sticking to it.
George, do you want to just walk us through these two sections?
Sure.
The nitrification section and the denitrification section.
Sure. What we tried to describe here is what a qualifying technology that might be applied in the watershed should look like. It should be configured with no more than one pump. That is how Florida actually defined passive. No more than one pump. And that pump cannot be allowed to use exclusively for just supplying air. When you talk about wastewater treatment, and I'm sure if Ray Jack was here or Amy Lowell was here, you would say, what is the most expensive part of your process? They would say, getting the air to the wastewater, because you're pumping it in with a compressor. So we thought, in order to be sustainable, you don't want to have systems come in that simply blow air into the wastewater to nitrify it, and then add some carbon source afterwards that you then have to go and keep replenishing. So we put these in here as sort of, you know, what we really believe should be considered sustainable. Low power consumption, 2 kilowatt hours a day. For instance, the most popular unit on Cape Cod right now that removes 50% of the nitrogen according to the state uses about 6 kilowatt hours a day. It's an air compressor, pretty much, regen pump, 6 to 7 kilowatt hours a day is what it uses. We thought, in context of what we think is a good sustainable plan that is low cost, 6 kilowatt hours a day is a little high. So we limit it to 10. The denitrification portion of the system needs to have a carbon source that's sustainable but without needing a lot of replacement for a period of at least 5 years. Because that speaks to what it will cost to actually maintain these systems. If you need somebody out there every 3 months to change your carbon source, every time you put somebody on a horse to go out to your place, you're talking probably about $100 a visit there. And you may be able to get some economy of scale, or they're doing 50 in one neighborhood, they're just, you know, going around replenishing carbon source. But our experience has been that although carbon sources are out there, there's many of them out there, some of them invented right here in Falmouth, Micro C or something like that, they still need to be replenished on a very regular basis, and that translates to money. So we thought, okay, how do we want to push the industry to address your needs for your TMDL here? We want to make them say, hey, we don't want anybody on that site except every 5 years. If it's less than 5 years, you better have a real easy way to replace it, because that speaks to the money and cost of maintaining the system. If you use carbon for wood for carbon source, excuse me, it's my dyslexia coming in. So if you use wood for a carbon source, then you probably are talking about decades that you would need to replace it. And a box of wood chips, for instance, in the nitric system, I think conservatively you're talking about 40 years worth of carbon there. So that would meet this criteria. And then within this document, we actually refer them to some of the Florida work that they can actually see how those systems were configured. And I will tell you now that even Florida right now is working into their regulations allowing a configuration of wood chips beneath a standard leach field inside of a liner. So they're using a passive system. So those are sort of the broad descriptions. I'd be glad to get into detail right down to the molecular level if you'd like, but it usually induces a coma in most people that I've talked to.
Steve.
George, when you weren't there to defend yourself, the working group modified 3.1.1. And so, because I was arguing that it makes sense to limit the power, and it makes sense for simplicity to limit the pumps to one pump. But why do you, if somebody came up with a system that met all your other criteria, what would be wrong if that one pump was less than 2 kilowatt hours per day and blew only air?
Oh,
You may not know of such a thing that exists, but
Yeah.
what's wrong with it if it meets all the other criteria?
No, I think my original wording was that it could not just be used to convey air. And you're right. I mean, if you could efficiently get air to wastewater, household wastewater in the volume that it's produced, or the strength if the volume is reduced, then, I mean, my intuition tells me, simply because I've seen enough products that have tried this, that you're not going to do it for less than 2 kilowatt hours a day.
So
I mean,
you
and
wouldn't mind
that's-
this wording, that no more than one pump for the conveyance of fluid is necessary, and no systems will be allowed where the total power consumption of all components is more than 2 kilowatt hours?
Yeah, no, that's fine. And the reason I said for the conveyance of liquid, the air pump, because there are systems that convey liquid using air, and they're more efficient than impeller pumps. And they serve two purposes. So if a pump, for instance, in a unit could use less than 2 kilowatt hours a day, could pressure dose the system and supply air for nitrification, then I say, hey, there, you're good. It's not going to meet the full air demand, but it may not have to meet the full air demand. Soil doesn't need air pumped to it to nitrify. But if it was enhanced with just a little bit of air, you might be able to downsize a leach field, for instance, and that saves money in real estate, and it's all about money in real estate. So yes, that's fine, that wording.
So,
John?
just a comment further, the next sentence, which I had done in yellow, is at the stage where we actually send this plan to DEP for their first reaction.
Could you read it, because for a number of us it didn't print out?
Okay, it says plans, specification, and rationale for their use will be provided in a covering letter when the plan is sent to DEP to get their initial reaction. So that's just George, us working together to have a covering letter for this thing, which in some detail says what we're trying to achieve.
We'll describe a configuration that will probably be what the industry will try to copy, really. It's just a nitrification area and a denitrification that passively passes it through the carbon source. I mean, that's, without getting real specific, that's the broad brush of it. Nitrify to denitrify using cellulose as a carbon source, because that's where we're driving it toward. There is no other source unless you have large amounts of a chemical on your property that slowly feeds over 5 years, but then requires maintenance. I mean, wood chips in a box don't require a whole lot of maintenance, whereas a carbon feed that might gum up because it's sugar or whatever, has high viscosity, then that requires maintenance. And it also requires somebody to say, is it working? So it requires a sensor, and then it requires electronics. That translates to cost. What we've seen with the Nitrex, fortunately Mr. Lombardo has provided a lot of data for us, and we've seen a lot because we've filled boxes with wood chips and saturated them and used them. What we find is it's pretty binary. It works or it doesn't work because somebody killed it with some chemical.
Thanks. Just a couple of things, George. So I guess that means that 75% removal is reasonable to expect, which is good. Which is what it says. Two other points. One is that, as we all know, that estuaries in general are nitrogen limited, and therefore the nitrogen coming in from the groundwater and the effluent from the septic systems is a major impact on our estuaries. Oyster Pond's a little different in that it's got very low salinity, and some of OPET's studies, I'm correct, have shown that it's not only nitrogen limited, but also phosphorus limited. So therefore, controlling phosphorus is another factor that these systems are really directed at denitrifying. So that's another question to look at in terms of this plan and what impact this intervention would have on Oyster Pond because of the phosphorus issue. And so I'm not sure. That's why, again, getting everything out of the watershed can help a lot more. But the phosphorus side of it is still, to me, a question that I don't think has been fully explored yet. And I think that's something that we need to keep in mind.
I don't have any comment. I mean, normally in marine waters, as you know, nitrogen is the limiting factor, and there's a lot of controversy around that whole fill ratio application being used in marine waters or even brackish waters. So I can't answer whether if you cut all the nitrogen off going into Oyster Pond, you would then have a phosphorus limited situation, and that would kick up harmful algae blooms or all the things that fresh water is heir to. I don't know that answer, so I can't answer it.
Excuse me, just one. I said OPET, it means Oyster Pond Environmental Trust, so that people know what that is.
We know who they are.
Yeah.
I think we might want to recognize that Ed Leather did address that issue in his presentation and suggested that we should be looking at nitrogen predominantly right now in Oyster Pond.
Okay, second page. No. So let's get through this process and then we'll hear from the board.
Okay, so the second, section 3.2 is we've proposed in this potential plan to do it in 2 phases. And so the way we thought of doing that is we took from Wright Pierce's alternative analysis for phase 1, 172 homes, which was in their alternative analysis if we sewered. And use those. We would then have a plan, phase 1, which would last for 6 years. It would allow people a year to get the permit after the project was started. It would give us 3 years to get all the systems in the ground, and then would give us 2 to 3 years to get data to show whether we needed to actually do phase 2. And phase 2 would be an additional 70 dwellings to bring it to 242, which is what we got, again, the number from the Wright-Pierce alternatives analysis.
John, are you finished with that paragraph?
Yep.
Or-
About that paragraph?
Yeah. I think we should consider carefully whether 6 years is enough, because if jumping to 4.1, you'll see in a second, the homeowners have 1 year to begin, and then 3 years after that to finish. So they have, there's 4 years from the start date until all the systems in phase 1 would be in. And then we're proposing to make, according to this document, the decision on phase 2 2 years after that. So you have only 2 years to allow for travel time and possible noise variations in the data. And intuitively, I would like to see another year in there at least.
At least. I mean, yeah, 3 years is ridiculously short, I think.
All right.
It should be a longer period of time.
Let me put my spin on it. I think we need to have a high bar to start, and the key point here is going to be adaptive. And we may see that things are on track and they're not there yet, but they're moving that way and they're close. If we leave it open and lengthen it, it's going to be very hard, functionally, politically, everything else, to tighten back up after the fact. So that's my read on it.
No,
Set a
but
high bar.
if things were going well,
Right,
then there is no phase 2 by definition.
Right.
right,
So it doesn't matter how long it takes. It never starts.
right, but,
And everybody's happy. You don't have to worry about any politics in that. If it's not going well, I think you have to wait till it's all in and it's all getting down, the plume has stopped flowing into the pond before you make the negative decision that you have to go with phase 2.
And I sort of build on this. There are really 2 going wells. And the first one, you're going to know if the system is in, it's gone through its year of probation, you've got the input and the output, and you'll know whether you're meeting your standards. So 6 years, that works for that. Is it going well or not? But the second going well is much harder, and that's the one I think that Matt was referring to.
right.
And
Yeah.
that
Water
is,
quality.
are you actually
Exactly.
meeting your TMDL? And so I just lay that out because I think that when you conceived of the phase 1, phase 2, you were talking about the operation of the system, not we have met the TMDL.
Maybe
Right.
from Little Pond, we'll know, what the response time.
That's right, and
What response time is reasonable.
yes.
That can be.
And it could be as much as 7 years, is informally what the Geological Survey has said.
I mean, my intuition is that DEP is going to react more negatively to 7 years than they are to 6. So
That's
why
my-
don't we try them on 7?
All right. Everybody on board with that?
Well,
Got it?
Sounds like that wins.
Right. They don't watch this show.
okay.
You hope.
Or you could say 6 years from the last IA system being put in from phase 1.
Well, that's a long way.
No, you
But-
are definitely. So it'll be 7 years
7
from the
years.
start date,
Yeah,
because the start date's a definite date.
Yep.
yeah.
Okay, keep going.
All right.
Yeah.
So then we get into the management plan, and this really has not changed a great deal from the generic management plan that we developed last year. It's been made to be more specific to Oyster Pond.
Well, just because there are people who may not have a copy of it in front of them, could we just kind of hit the highlights?
So there are property owner requirements. And that basically says, and I think from George's experience with the West Falmouth project, there have been issues in West Falmouth that the homeowners really objected to surface manifestation of the systems we put in the ground there. In other words, the sampling ports. They didn't want to see that in their nice manicured lawns. So I think one of the things that we need to do is make it quite clear to the property owners, we have to have these things set up so that our people can get in and measure things and we don't want to have to dig up a port to get to make a measurement. We need to have things out on the surface. And so this basically gives the town the right to access private property, and that we will require that the owners sign up for certain things. So do people have anything more to that?
No, keep going.
So the municipal participation, one of the things we thought here, you're going to get vendors who come, and we had initially thought, well, maybe the way to do this was to give each property owner a grant, which would sort of be equal to the 30% participation that the town gives when we do a sewer project. But we sort of retract here and said, okay, maybe what we do is we get the town to audition vendors, pick a vendor or vendors, and then the town will actually supply the homeowners with the hardware. In other words, here's the system, and the homeowner then would be responsible for the engineering, the installation, and the landscaping. And so that would be our way of the municipality participating in the project.
This is sort of parallel to what the town's experience was recently in the sewer project, where for people who had to have what they call grinder pumps and the low pressure pumps, the town went out and did its own procurement process. It described the kind of pumps that it would like. It got a couple of bids. It picked one. It bought the units and gave them to the homeowner. The homeowner was still responsible for putting them in and connecting them to the sewer, but the town provided them at no charge.
I was just gonna, in municipal participation, it seems that my discussions with Brian Dudley, who is, I think, still with
Yes.
DEP, he was saying that for any system of this scale that would be put in, that he would expect, he would suggest, let's put it in those terms, that the municipality take responsibility for the monitoring.
That's coming.
That's coming.
Oh, that's coming up.
It's coming.
Okay, I didn't see that element. Yeah, has the DPW looked at this? Do we have a comment from Ray Jack or anything?
They looked at an earlier version, which included the monitoring piece, that there is an entity, not necessarily the DPW, but there's a designated municipal entity. So he hasn't seen the latest version, but he has seen certainly the generic version, and that was part of it.
So that's this next section, responsible management entity.
John, this may be considered a detail, but I think sooner rather than later, not necessarily today, but not too far off, we have to specify whether the parts that the town supplies includes the settling tank and the leaching field component, because it affects how, what's going to
Yeah, I
cost
think,
people.
to me, that's a detail we're going to get to when we actually start thinking about putting things in the ground. So this responsible management entity, there will have to be some town entity that takes responsible for overseeing these. In our discussions, it would seem probably that the Board of Health is the obvious management entity within town. They deal with Title V, they deal with alternative septic systems. And I'm sure that would meet with Ray's approval enthusiastically. So then, is there any question about that? Then the next section is enhanced IA system approval. And so that management entity would set out a specification, very much like that first section that George was talking about in generic terms, would say, you know, these are the specifications we're looking for, and invite vendors to bid on it. And then the management entity would pick one or more of those systems that would be eligible to be used in the watershed. So then the next section describes the probationary period.
Under performance monitoring.
Under performance monitoring. So I don't know if we need to go into the details of.
Yeah, this is the same as it was
Yeah.
when it came here before us.
Then it says, you know, after the probationary period. So we had a whole scheme of sampling 1/12 of the systems every year after the probationary period, and using that as to calculate the watershed load. And we get to later on how that works. Then there's a section on compliance system monitoring. That's that 1/12 that units that get done every year. Then there's a section on operation and maintenance, how that would be done by the responsible management entity. Pump outs, how often the systems would need to be pumped out, which is basically following what Title V says. They would be, the management entity would pump all the systems every 5 years or as indicated by inspection. And then record keeping is the next section. The management entity, we assume, will have to supply to DEP on an annual basis a whole set of reporting things. The engineered and as-built plans submitted electronically, water readings, and we're assuming that every home would have an automatic telemetering water meter. The idea would be that we'd actually have receivers on telephone poles within the watershed so that we could get water readings on real time. They'd just go back to the management entity and we could get water readings daily or every other week or monthly or however we wanted to do it. We would supply DEP with the monitoring results for total nitrogen. They would keep the operation and maintenance records and also the pumping records. And then the next section is the reporting section. And here, it would probably be useful to go through these. This is reporting to DEP how we think the whole watershed is doing. And there under the first section, all systems meet the effluent standard of either 10 milligrams per liter or 75% removal of total nitrogen. Systems that fail to meet the standard are balanced by systems that are exceeding the standard. We know from West Falmouth that some of these do much better than 10, or as George just said, considerably better than 75%. So if you have a few that aren't making it, you can make the case to DEP. On balance, we're getting the nitrogen out of the watershed that we need to. That we actually meet the TMDL at the Sentinel station, which is our ultimate goal. And then the fourth method is what George has been describing by mass balance. If you know the influent and you know the effluent and you know the amount of water that's been used, you can get a whole watershed load and report that to DEP. And then the final section is on fees. This sort of mimics what we've been doing for sewer fees all over town. Each dwelling unit with an enhanced IA system will be assessed a semi-annual fee based on water use that will cover the appropriate management entity costs. And then there was just a little section that I threw in at the end, basically as a sale to the state. The benefits to the state are that after implementation and successful completion of the project, the systems would be eligible for general use approval and could be used throughout the state. In other words, if DEP were to allow us to follow this plan, by the end of our 6 years, we would have had enough systems in the ground that they and their data would be sufficient to be granted general use approval. And it's a way for the state to say, okay, Falmouth is going to move this needle and get us a general use system that meets 10 milligrams per liter or the risk to the state, of course, is that allowing us to put in 172 units without state official approvals at the moment is a risk to them. And that's a risk that we're going to have to persuade them is worth taking. The benefits to the town is that by installing a few systems, will allow streamlined O&M, and at the end of the project, we will have IA systems that we can use in our other 14 watersheds in town as we see fit. And the risk, of course, is to the town that we choose systems that don't perform to the standards that we think they will.
I was just wondering, should it say 75% or no more than 10 milligrams per liter? Because like 75% of 100, the example you gave, would be 25 milligrams per liter. So I'm just wondering if it should be no more than 10.
Right now it says less than 10.
No, it's the intention to allow it to be more than 10 if you're removing 75%. In other words, if you have 100 coming in, even if you only have 25 coming out, which doesn't meet 10,
right?
You've removed 75%. In other words, it's sort of the thinking is that you must have been one of those really bad actors that was causing the concentration in the pond to go high. So now we're taking out 75% of your evil behavior. Just kidding. And that's therefore proportionately contributing to improving the concentration in the pond.
Right.
In
line with all those pie charts that Brian has.
Right.
Let me just make 2 points that might not have come out here. The responsible management entity would be the town, but it could contract out a lot of these activities. Clearly, the town is not going to get into the septic pumping business. It's going to contract that out. The monitoring business is quite likely to be contracted out to a county entity or any.
We already do the tracking.
Exactly, and somebody already does it now. So it's not like we're going to have this new bureaucracy down in the health department taking on all these tasks. The tasks will be their responsibility, but someone else will be doing it in most cases. The other piece, for the benefit of tree types, it would be, we've been talking as if every single house has to have one of these all by itself. Where there are entities that have, for example, 62 units, there's an economy of consolidating the connections to have a lot fewer than 62 IAs, or even 31 IAs. You could get down to the model in the vineyard can take 100,000 gallons. They do big ones. So you could have a great benefit of scale in certain instances.
That's a good say. 2 comments. Going back to the fees, because we agreed in the working group to bring this issue up at this meeting. I disagree with basing the fees on water use. That works for sewers. Sewers are intrinsically flow devices, pipes, pumps, giant tanks out at Blacksmith Shop Road. This, although it involves flow, the flow is not directly related to the cost to the town. It's the monitoring. And for instance, in the economy of scale for treetops, one of the huge economies is the reduced monitoring. So I think to incent, and since they're doing their own engineering for that, to incentivize them, and also as a model for other places in town, to incentivize sharing, that it should be based on our earlier version, which is like an enterprise, I think it's called enterprise funding in the town, should be based on the cost of monitoring and inspection and all those things that the town actually does.
I do think it's worth mentioning the treetops that, and George and I have chatted about this. If you, for instance, just as an example, you were able to do those 60 units with 4 shared systems, they're going to be of a size that DEP is not going to acquiesce to our 1/12 monitoring measurements. They're going to say, if you take example, the Coonamessett Inn has a system there, which is an IA. They have to report on that every month. Seacrest is the same way. So that as you aggregate into shared systems, it's going to have a more intensive monitoring scheme. So that it will probably work out to be very similar to a per unit cost.
Well, you pick up, you lose a factor of 12, and you pick up a factor of 31.
But we got the issue.
Yeah, but also, you know, just to know the wording here, this is, I think the intent here is very good. But when I read this, all systems meet the effluent standard of 10 milligrams total nitrogen per liter, or 75% is under reporting, 4.10.1. All systems meet the effluent standard of 10 milligrams per liter, or 75% removal of total nitrogen, okay? So if everyone says, okay, we'll do 75%, that means we could have an effluent at 25. Because if they can do either, they can do under 10, or 75%. It's just,
That's
it's
right.
the wording here.
That's right.
So everyone could hit the target 75%, which if they're all putting out 100 milligrams per liter, then we're not achieving the goal.
No, we are.
But
We are, because if they're all putting out that much, either Brian Howes made mistakes, which I don't think he did, or else a huge amount of the nitrogen that's going into the pond is coming from home septic systems, and now we're getting rid of 75% of it, which meets the TMDL.
But if it's 25 milligrams per liter coming out, George said, you said that you measured something at 102 or
Well,
something.
remember, it's not the concentration, it's the load.
Yeah.
It's 25 milligrams per liter at how many gallons? So what's the load? If you've reduced the load by 75%, you've reduced the load by 75%. You can't go by the concentration, you go by concentration and volume. So the load reduction of 75% is a load reduction of 75%. If your watershed says you have to remove 50% of the load from the septic systems, you can either play that by looking at the concentrations and assuming an influent, which is really what DEP does when they talk about 50% removal, or you can actually calculate that load reduction and say we're getting rid of 75%.
So Ron, I think the going from 40 to 10 is where the 10 comes from. And if it turns out that you have an input that is higher than 40, there should be others that are lower, and it's going to average out. And it boils down to the mass. And so the scenario that you described, as Steve was saying, could not be possible in the big picture. Like, it's not possible to take out 75% and miss the mark unless Brian's wrong.
Any other comments from the committee? Because there's a couple of folks from the neighborhood who.
Two quick points. Under 4.9, the record keeping, it says records may include. Would it be better if we said will include? I mean, if we have these numbers, they should be part of the record.
I don't know that you'll have as-built plans on all properties. This is a watershed that is largely already built.
Right, but if the records,
They're putting in new IA, so.
Right.
There will be a new.
so I would suggest will include, not may include. Because, again, if you set a high standard, it's easier to back
Yeah.
off than come along later and try to raise it.
Just
Okay.
shall.
That's a,
Shall, but shall.
yeah, or, well, shall is one of those soft words.
Shall does it.
Shall is, okay. And John, on the 4.9 compliance system monitoring, the unoccupied seasonal homes, the system has to be jiggered so that somehow they get swept up into the random number thing, but I didn't, it wasn't clear from here.
We fixed that on the other version.
Well, that's what I thought we
Because of your
did.
good suggestion.
Right,
And I think that got transferred here.
okay.
Yeah, it's under 4.6.
That's where I am right now, I'm looking at it, and,
Each property will be.
Because each month, when you do the random number generator, you exclude properties already
right,
sampled.
sure,
So your pool gets richer and richer, and then in the summertime, just before September 1st, which is why September 1st was.
right. They'll be
All
scooped
the
up.
out-of-town people, then they lose. That's when they get chosen.
Yeah.
Right.
Okay.
Any other committee comments?
Quickly, on the state impact of the 172 units, I think it's important to keep in mind that since you need 50 units for general approval, you definitely want to get 2 or more vendors, each with 50 units. Because then when you apply all this good work to some other estuary, you don't want there to be just one vendor that has the general approval, who then makes up his losses on low bidding on Oyster Pond to charge huge prices everywhere else in town.
We just have to see how many technologies are going to come in and meet our requirements.
Right.
But that's the optimum. Find 2 or 3 vendors so that you're over that hump.
Right.
Right, okay. That's the treetops. Please, and then Bill.
Okay, do you want
You just have to maybe come to the front.
Today it doesn't matter. We have a new technology here which is not in place
to
yet.
stand on this piece of carpet here?
Any way you want.
Okay, so I'm Richard Hale, I live at Treetops. For full disclosure, I am a board member, but I'm here really as a private owner. However, I am sort of communicating what I hear back to the board. At some point, there will probably be some formal group at Treetops that's looking at this. But thank you, Eric, for bringing up the fact that there may be a different approach at Treetops. We're very interested in understanding what will be most efficient for us to do. We're spending a lot of money on Treetops right now, and we're doing a lot of landscaping work as part of that, which we really can't delay doing because it has to do with drainage and other things that will protect our investment. But we really would like to be able to look at options, but we don't want to. We want to do that in the context of what the town will permit us to do and what the technology permits us to do. So I don't know today if you have a recommendation for how we engage with you folks, whether it's just staying plugged in. When I hear you make comments about various things, I always want to say, well, that's fine, but I know you don't need a lot of little inputs from us as you move along, but we want to make sure that our interests are being heard and that we are understanding, getting educated on where this is going and what it may look like. And I do realize behind all of this, the town could opt for a completely different approach, but we need to be prepared.
Mhm.
So is there any advice that you might have for how we stay part of the process here?
I'll make some comments. For the next 18 months, the way you stay involved is in the preparation of the draft CWMP that Wright Pierce is putting together now. That's a document that ultimately has to be voted by the selectmen, so there will need to be a public meeting, probably a presentation to the selectmen sometime next year. I'm just going to grab us maybe June, maybe May. And then ultimately there will be a vote of the selectmen to send that document to the state. That is going to have the 2 options, and with the recommended plan, and that document hasn't been drafted at this point, but this is clearly a key piece of it. That's my first point. My second is that once it gets submitted to the state, then there's a comment period, and that comment period is open to anybody, anywhere, any organization, and then there's a response to that. So that's going to happen in the 2020 timeframe. If the Oyster Pond, and this is my own comment, if the Oyster Pond watershed goes the sewer direction, then it's going to be tied to other decisions the town has to make.
Right.
Okay. If it goes the IA direction, then it could happen sooner than 2025, depending on a town financing plan, because you would not be tied to the state revolving fund decisions that the town has to be involved in if it's sewer.
Understood.
So there will be multiple opportunities for involvement as an organization and as individuals. I think your board of directors, if they feel things are reaching a point where they just need to have a conversation and have everybody all, then just ask us.
Yeah, that's great. My concern is that whatever gets presented to the state accommodates what might work better for treetops. I made the comment at the public meeting that treetops is a large percentage of the watershed, and it's going to be implemented first, and that that being so, it sounds to me like it ought to be really integral to what the state initially says, yeah, that's good, let's do that. So I don't know how that works, and I don't know how the technology will be evaluated, but if you're picking three, one of those three, I would like to believe, would operate in a, cluster situation like ours.
Okay.
So, my intuition is that if we were to send this plan to DEP and they acquiesced to this as a plan, that they would be amenable to shared systems.
Oh, I think.
So that, I don't think that needs to be Plan 3. I think that fits within the scope
That's good to hear.
of the IA system.
Yeah.
And I'm pretty sure that that would be the reaction of DEP.
Okay.
And it's in our interest to support engineering and testing and installation of cluster system here for the same reason the individual systems, that there'll be other places in town where we'll need cluster systems.
I would think if the committee is okay with this, that we could send you this draft.
That'd be great.
And you could send us written comments back on every point that you think needs comment.
Okay. I would appreciate
Let's
that.
start with that,
After we fix the ground.
after we fix the grammar.
Great, I think it's,
Okay, let's do that, Bill. Environmental.
I'll go.
We do have Wendy here, who's our executive director from Spore Gardens, from the watershed, which includes, Spore Gardens includes many areas, includes the general areas that we're talking about with regard to many areas which are more than just a single resident surrounding pond areas. And I think that your comment on opportunities within those areas that still fill within IA has some good general usage for Oyster Pond. We have always tried to point out from Oyster Pond, from the environmental technology standpoint, that nitrogen is the primary element of concern with the pond. And we have multiple studies you can see on our website associated with that.
I wonder if you had any comments on what we presented today.
Well, we will have some general comments. It's very nice it is very welcome to me to see the board advance to the stage that it is now and going forward with details on an IA alternative and more flesh and skeleton on the actual management aspect of the INA. That's very encouraging, great step forward as far as I see it. There are groups around Oyster Pond at the present time who are working to try and enlist help of the owners surrounding the pond area too to come forward and assist in either alternative or with the I-8 alternative at the present time, and may welcome opportunities to have systems placed on that.
I'm glad you raised that point, because I think he and we both have access to funds that have been previously granted for homeowners who would like to put an experimental IA in. And you have some subsidy money, and I think
Yes.
we still have some subsidy money for that purpose. So if you have these homeowners who want to do it,
Sure.
let George know.
Okay, we'll be in touch with you then later on. And again, very much appreciate your efforts On the aspect, just from past history, aspects of phosphorus, the organization for the watershed has taken a great deal of effort to try and make sure that phosphorus is being controlled, and most effectively so far runoff control has been put in place on Ransom Road, and also looked at very carefully with regard to watershed laws that are now, people are reminded associated with that in the entire watershed area. And I also, even back to way back with the town, when the town was doing more work, and Virginia was very much involved with that, on keeping phosphorus out of our own freshwater ponds. There were extensive studies done by the fact that these septic systems that you're talking about, they discharge to the soil and the groundwater, and there's phosphorus removal associated with that, and some extensive studies that have been done in the past by both EPA and also by the town that can be looked at as far as effective phosphorus removal from the operating systems.
Thank you very much. Wendy?
I want to speak.
Could you stand?
15 minutes.
Yeah, don't do this.
Is that better? Okay. Hi. Wendy Bissler, Executive Director, Oyster Pond Environmental Trust. I think this is a great effort moving forward. It's really nice to see us, all this kind of coming together as a plan. And if I could get a copy of that too, that would be very helpful. Yeah, I haven't seen it.
Absolutely.
That would be great.
Yeah, I haven't seen
Happy
it.
to do that.
Going back to the subsidy monies, do you want me to send that out to our membership that that's available, or do you rather not? I mean, I could let
Yeah,
her.
we have a grant through EPA to put in some pilot systems. And it's called the SNAP watershed area. And we're working through with the Buzzards Bay Coalition. They do most of our legal work for us, which is getting the permits through and dealing with those pesky boards of health, things like that. So you can contact the Buzzards Bay Coalition, and they come out and they actually talk to a homeowner whether they want to be, an experimental system. There are some pluses and minuses to it. The subsidy is always a plus. The minus is it's an experimental system.
Why don't we get back to you on that?
Yeah,
Just
sure.
because
I just thought.
We have to get out of here in
Yes,
10 minutes, and we got a few things to do, but we understand. If you've got people interested, we can talk about it.
I could invite people to be interested.
Okay.
That was my
Okay,
point.
well,
Yeah.
let's
Yeah,
pursue
right.
that.
Okay.
Thank you.
This will be very brief, but I think there's a blatant inconsistency in telling Treetops that they have to wait to find out if we're doing sewers or IAs, but we're telling other people that we'll pay them to put in IAs. I can't get my mind around that. That's all I want to say.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, I mean, there is still the possibility we could go to the sewer route.
Yeah.
Yes, that's true.
Things would have to be pulled out of the ground and,
They would know that.
yeah. Right, okay, thank you.
I can see we're not going to have time to do much about the Mill Pond study.
Mr. Chairman?
Sure. You don't need the mic, there is no mic.
But we can see you better.
My name is Paul Troy, I'm meeting member precinct 2. It's a really fascinating discussion on looking at new technology, particularly with Oyster Pond, and I compliment you on that. But I had a very practical question on implementation. You made reference to 30% funding support from the town for Little Pond, and then you mentioned one option would be to provide the equipment. How does that fit in? Is that 25, 50%? How does that,
It would,
in relation to the engineering and
about the
installation?
same sort of contribution.
About the same? Yeah. I was just curious.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, I think Mill Pond, you have to wait till the next meeting.
Well, let's find out.
Okay, go ahead. Go ahead.
Okay, I don't see anybody here from Mill Pond, so that's my first point.
Right.
The second is, I do want to keep things moving in terms of getting our feedback to Brian House so that this report can be finalized. And so I just wanted to have a sense from the board members, whether you had just factual corrections, or whether there are anyone has a substantive issue.
Maybe they could email their corrections or additions to Eric.
Yes.
I just have one question that wasn't dealt with in the report. We're looking at the Green Pond watershed. So, and Mill Pond is just north of that, flows in. But on the Coonamessett watershed, there is now this major reworking of the Coonamessett River to use natural type things. Mill Pond is an artificial pond that was created by
Stan,
which is the road, I guess, basically, 28.
So it's a question.
So, yeah, so the question is, was that option looked at following what's going on with the Coonamessett to basically return it to its more natural state? And would that, I don't know if the neighbors would be happy with that, but whether that would have
Did you read the
an
report?
effect. Yes, I did.
Okay, then you answer the question.
There is no discussion of that option.
There you have it.
that's right. The contract was to do a diagnostic, an analysis of let's call it the environmental health of the pond, and to look to see what inputs, both phosphorus and nitrogen, what inputs there were to the pond, where they came from, and could they be quantified, and then possibly how it would be managed. That was the scope of work.
Right, but at the end of the report, it says that things like aeration and some controls and different things might be options to employ, but it didn't mention anything about returning it to its original state, as we're doing with the Coonamessett River.
I don't see how we can do this justice in the time remaining. Isn't there time in another meeting?
Well,
Yes.
the problem is, Brian wants his response from us by the end of...
No, he gave us 30 days.
30 days,
So,
right.
so we could take this up at the next meeting.
Well, I mean, if it's a matter of him getting paid, I think
No.
it's a decent report, but
Yeah.
what we do about it is way more complicated than 10
Then-
minutes.
then-
Correct. No,
Fine,
agreed.
I just wanted to get a sense from the committee.
I basically just today looked at the recommendation section.
Yeah.
And of the three recommendations seem to be fairly well thought out. I'm not sure they're all equally viable, but
Okay.
I think that as a conclusion to the study was.
So we could send it around, comments to Eric, and Ann have it on the agenda at the next meeting.
And that's what I'm going to do. Okay, I'll be chairing the next meeting, that's what I'm asking now. Okay, and I would think the same thing with the master schedule, that I'm looking for input. And this is sort of a first draft, but it integrates lots of different things. So that will be on the next agenda as well. Our next meeting is on the 20th, and the U.S. Geological Survey is going to be here to let us know what they're finding in Maravista.
We're now at the point of report of members of staff. I have one report, or an invitation actually, I just got today from the town manager. They're planning a joint meeting on Monday, September 17th. It was originally going to be with the Conservation Commission. They have now invited the Coastal Resilient Actions Committee, and they have now invited us. The agenda items so far include the Perch Pond dredging / Great Bay erosion issue. I've suggested that they take on a conversation about the Minot Road repair or replacement or
Necessary.
the combination, the road and beach erosion problem at Minot. And there may be other suggested topics that other people would want to suggest that this large group take up. But I wanted everyone to know that Monday, September 17th, you're all invited.
7 p.m. usual time.
We assume it's at 7 o'clock.
They have been starting at 6:30 sometimes, but because they're folding in these other groups, we'll just have to watch.
There's no time on the invitation, so I don't know.
Can you forward that to us so we can just sort of look at, I don't think I grasped it all.
Sure.
Okay.
Doesn't have a time. So, That's all we know now. Any other report of members and staff? I'm sorry we're truncating today, but the Board of Appeals has apparently something that's going to take up more time than usual. They asked us to be out at 5, and we're going to do that.
Matt, can you grab number 5?
Is that my cue?
Yeah, I was gonna say, can you grab number 5 at 5?
That is your cue.
So, motion to adjourn.
I'll second.
Move the second to adjourn. All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? The ayes have it. Thank you very much.